As the scandal involving horse meat sold as beef widens across Europe, the European Commission is stepping in. Officials want stringent checks of the meat industry. Will it be enough to counter an international criminal conspiracy? And will it restore consumer confidence? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, it's a scandal that says a lot about modern eating habits and the desire for ever cheaper processed food. Meat products from across Europe have been found to be contaminated with horse meat. Well, in some cases, ready meals like beef lasagna were found to contain up to 99% horse meat. Blame has been variously cast around on regulators and food manufacturers. Officials have even hinted at international organised criminals playing with a multi-million-dollar industry. But it does raise the question, how much do we know about the multinational supply chains that provide our food? And how much do we really want to know? Peter Sharp has this report from Paris.
Across Europe, shopping habits are changing. The food contamination scandal reflected in a lack of confidence among consumers from Paris to Prague. Séverine Levenk, mother of two, says you can no longer trust what's being sold to you.
I will definitely change my way of shopping, and I won't buy product with meat inside anymore. I will buy meat separately and vegetables separately, but not ready-made product.
In Brussels, agriculture ministers were meeting to discuss the horse meat scandal that now affects 16 countries across the European Union.
We are proposing two series of tests over an initial period of 1 month, but the intention is to continue with the tests over a period of 3 months, but the first results, so that would have an idea of what is going on, will be issued after 30 days, 6 weeks.
The scandal has thrown light on the shadowy world of EU food production. Initial investigations by French officials reveal that Pujol bought frozen meat from a trader in Cyprus. The trader had received it from a Dutch food supplier who'd purchased it from 2 Romanian slaughterhouses. Back in France, Pujol supplied the meat to a Luxembourg factory where it was sold on under the Swedish-based brand Findus. It's now become a pan-European crisis. In the north of England, police and food standards inspectors raided this slaughterhouse and meat processing company suspected of selling on horse meat as beef. France has moved quickly to tackle the food crisis. A high-level judicial inquiry is due to report back on Thursday on whether the Europe-wide contamination scandal is a case of mislabeling or, as seems more likely, whether fraud is involved. Peter Sharp, Al Jazeera in Paris.
Well, joining us now from London are our guests. Andrew Webb, he's the editor of lovefood.com and he's the author of the book Food Britannia. And Martin Bentham, the Home Affairs editor of the Evening Standard. Welcome to you all. If we could start perhaps with Andrew. One of the questions that really is surprising in all this is how can authorities still not know exactly who is behind all of this?
At the moment, there's a pass the parcel with the blame, isn't there? The FSA are blaming the government, there's retailers are blaming the suppliers. No one's got a clue what's going on. It's a perfect storm of it's just a disaster, really.
It is a bit. Martin, I mean, the scandal does involve...
The FSA...
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the FSA really needs to get a grip. This is food's equivalent of the Leveson inquiry in my book, and the FSA is looking a lot like the Press Complaints Commission, ineffectual, and doesn't look like it's know what's going on. And it's got, I would say, a matter of days to get a grip.
It does, but in their defence, they would probably say they've had their mandate and funds slashed. We'll come to that in a minute, though. But, Martin, this scandal, when you look at it, it involves different countries, different companies, different parts of the supply chain. You've got to be really pulling off a widespread, complex conspiracy to make something like this work, haven't you?
I'm not sure that's the case. It has to be a widespread conspiracy, but I think you've just illuminated the problem of tracing what's gone wrong, because there are so many different people involved in this chain. There is food being produced, horse meat from Romania, from this country. It's going to France, it's going to the Netherlands. Different producers in France are involved in this, and so actually tracing where contaminated food has got to, contaminated horse meat has got to, is actually quite tricky. The discovery today that there's been horse meat, contaminated horse meat, which has got a painkiller in it, those carcasses have gone to France, and of course the French will now be trying to trace exactly where that has gone. And because we've got this very, very complex food chain now, particularly with processed foods, with one manufacturer supplying a carcass, another processing the meat and so on, and then it going to the retailers, where responsibility lies and where something goes wrong is actually quite tricky to establish. And obviously what it does need is rigorous checks all the way through the process, which
isn't
perhaps haven't been
that was going to
happening.
be my next point, really, is surely somewhere along this very long and complicated chain, somebody was checking, somebody was looking at what they're importing, exporting, processing?
Well, I don't know about what happens precisely. I mean, of course, there are rules and regulations, and of course, I don't know quite what the level of enforcement of those of the relevant checks is in the countries overseas. The checks here, as you were again pointing out earlier on, that there is controversy here about the role of the Food Standards Agency and whether it's sufficiently rigorous now in terms of enforcing standards, and so I think that is exactly it. And of course, the retailers as well, they conduct checks supposedly and meant to sort of trace their supply chains, but that's a big question as well as to whether they should be doing more due diligence in effect on where they're receiving the goods from. Supposedly
was a key word there. Let's take the discussion to Andrew, because I could see you shaking your head, and let me ask you the same question. I mean, even if the FSA has dropped the ball a little bit here, no one else is checking?
Well, I think the responsibility lies with the retailers, because that's the point of sale. That's the point. It only enters the food chain when somebody buys it to eat. So that's, if you're going to pick a point to start, I would say that they have to make sure that their food chain is watertight. So I would put the emphasis back on them.
Now, you mentioned the FSA's role, but the trend has been to cut down on their budgets, their mandate. They've had some of their functions given out to other agencies. They've lost staff. Is it fair to focus in on them and then come at this point and say, well, why haven't they done a better job?
Well, there's a Dr. Wolf there who they used to have a testing policy, and they were naming and shaming retailers, according to him, and that was quietly pushed aside, and some of their roles were given to DEFRA, some of it was given to the Department of Health. So you can see how this issue has fallen plumb square between these three agencies. And I think if the Food Standard Agency isn't upholding standards in food, who else can? It's just such a complex issue, and it's just created such a perfect storm for discord and squabbling and politics and food and class, and all these sort of issues are all blowing around. There's a lot of noise around it, but I don't think anything will change, really. Food scares have happened since time began, and we see this with Sudan 1, we saw this with dioxins in pork. This goes right back to Victorian times when they were putting bone ash in bread and sand in sugar. There will always be somebody trying to make a fast buck and to offer something that's a little bit under par and turning a blind eye, and that will always go on, I'm afraid to say.
It probably will, but in the UK, of course, the horse meat scandal comes at a rather embarrassing time for the government. A cross-party group of MPs says the Food Standards Agency needs tougher powers to force producers to test food. Well, the government cut the agency's funding and staff, as our guests have been mentioning, leaving them with what's called a diminished role. Ministers have also plans to reduce food labelling standards. Britain is trying to seek an exemption from EU laws that require a label declaring the amount of meat in all food products. So it doesn't seem like the situation is about to get any better right now. It's the other question, perhaps, Martin, in all of this. When you start to do some research on this, you find that for example, a Dutch businessman suspected of being one of the links between the slaughtering horse slaughterers and abattoirs in Romania and the European food suppliers who bought the horse meat from these abattoirs, is a person who had a conviction in 2012 and did some jail time for previously selling horse meat from Argentina and trying to pass it off to Muslim consumers as halal beef. How does that happen? How do you get a conviction and go back to business and do it again?
Well, I think the same has happened here. One of the suppliers here is under scrutiny. I think there are question marks about his previous record as well. So, yes, that raises a very serious question as to whether people who have been seen to do exactly the sort of thing that was just being referred to, of trying to do some sharp practice which allows them to sell something more cheaply than masquerading as a more expensive product. Those people clearly shouldn't be allowed to continue in the business. Once you've been seen to offend once, then that should surely be it. And I think it does raise another big question about the whole approach of the government, which cuts across other areas as well. Of course, they are, as you pointed out, trying to strip back regulation to an extent and so on. And ultimately, unfortunately, these things are required. You do need to have rigorous checks. The retailers, yes, have responsibility, but also you can't rely entirely on the retailers. You've also got to have people like the Food Standards Agency in this country taking a robust approach, making sure that the standards are enforced right down the line, because otherwise the people at the bottom end potentially will engage in this type of sharp practice.
Andrew, what about the role perhaps by associations of some of the manufacturers and processors? Self-regulation, is that part of the solution here?
I don't think so at all. I think self-regulation just doesn't work. We've seen that in pretty much every sector and every industry. It's like putting drunks in charge of breathalyzing people. It's just not going to work, I don't think. I think there's a role the consumer has to play in all of this. We've talked about industry and government and that sort of stuff, but the consumer, we've had so much cheap food, and the consumer's got to realise that if you can buy 4 100% beef burgers for 50p, that's just not going to wash. With grain prices going up, with fuel costs going up, and everything else is rising, and you think, well, how, if these animals are costing this much to feed, how can this be so cheap? And actually consumers have got to start asking themselves, why is this cheap? One good thing to come out of all this, I suppose,
do you think that people can ask that question, though, Andrew, at a time when, you know, let's not forget the financial crisis in the European continent is pinching everyone's pocketbook? If you find a cheap burger, you're probably going to jump at it, aren't you?
Well, there's cheap meat, and then there's sort of made to look like cheap meat. Things like burgers, sausages, and as soon as you start mincing stuff up and putting it in other things and putting layers of sauce on it and obfuscating it and playing around with it and moving it between different countries, the potential for deceit and duplicity there just grows and grows. So cheap meat, as in cheap cuts of meat and different bits and bobs, oxtail and things like that, you know, there are cheap cuts. And there are ways to sort of save money and be price conscious, but also, you know, it's a beef burger that costs that much to produce. You've got to start asking certain questions, and it's, you know, why not make your own?
It is it not, Martin, a very complex food chain? When we think of beef that you buy and it says on the packet, this is minced beef, it's not that simple though, really, is it?
Well, not at all, and I think actually the issue of consumer power will be quite interesting over the coming weeks and months, because clearly those supermarkets, Tesco for example, found to be selling burgers that contained a very high prevalence of horse meat. Whether people will be reluctant, I think at the immediate point they will be reluctant to buy these products. Whether that continues or not, and that's in one way where some pressure can come on, because then the supermarkets will be compelled, just for commercial reasons, to actually try to make sure that they have got proper products. And also people, I think, going back to the labelling point, we do need very clear labels. People need to look at the labels to be clear whether they are getting, when they're getting a beef burger, how much beef is actually in it, what else is in there, and understand properly what food they're eating, because of course there's nothing wrong with having a cheap product, but it's best to know whether what the cheap product is what you think it is. It's not a beef burger, it's a sort of half beef burger, a quarter beef burger, plus a lot of other junk often, in fact. All
right, Andrew, at the beginning of this we were told that there's no real health consideration. It's more or less a cultural thing. Now we're being told things like 8 horses have been found to have had boot in them, and they're waiting for tests that might come back in April for tests for other medication that may be in some of the horses. I mean, it is looking like this may not be 100% just a case of cultural aversion, right?
Oh, no, it's not over yet. Not over yet, by a long way, I don't think. The trouble is, as more and more scandals come out, the public just become anaesthetised to it, and just kind of, it becomes a bit, oh, well, another scandal. And it's wrong to do that. Just on your point on the culturally sort of thing, we did a survey on lovefood.com about asking, would you eat horse meat? 65% of people said they would, if it was clearly labelled as such. People have been abroad and tried it in different countries. You know, maybe now they won't, and that's a bit of a shame. That might take some of the pressure off some of the other species we eat. After all, horses don't get TB, they don't get foot and mouth. You know, why not eat them? But I think this has sort of set that whole question aside, and people are just angry and confused, and it's just come on top of so many other scares and, you know, establishment letdowns from government agencies, the press, everything. People are just sick to the back teeth of it, really.
And Martin, I mean, how do we know that it's only horses? If this is perhaps an organised criminal gang that's cheating, how do we know it's only horses that's made its way into the food chain?
Well, we don't, absolutely, and also what we do know already from some of the tests that have been done on other products is that things like pork have ended up in beef and so on. So clearly there are potential issues about what else is in there. That's absolutely correct. And there's nothing wrong, for example, with eating horse meat. It's a perfectly we don't eat it in this country, just culturally it's not something we eat, but actually there's nothing wrong with it. The question about this is knowing what is in the food that you're eating. And that's what you're very right to point out that is a big question at the moment, knowing exactly what has gone in to the products that are in front of you when you go to the supermarket or wherever it is you're buying the burger or other processed meat product from. And quite frankly, yes, other things could be. I think probably most likely to be horse meat because it's easier, as I understand, to mask beef, for example, with horse meat rather than something else, but I wouldn't be entirely reassured.
We've had other scares, haven't we? Let's look at some of the reaction that's been coming in on Facebook. Robert points out deliberate fraud in product ingredients doesn't just apply to the horse meat scandal here in the UK. One of Britain's biggest food distribution companies has withdrawn a range of halal products after claims it may have provided products to prisons with traces of pork DNA. The company also delivers to hospitals, schools, care homes, hotels and cafes. David says, the main thing to come out of this is, I wish the UK would sell real horse burgers identified as such, given how apparently they would be cheaper and taste exactly the same. And Ivory says, yum, I'd like to try horse meat. Well, Ivory may get a chance soon, the way the economics is working. Let's talk a little bit now about the solutions. As you know, the European Commission is talking about perhaps stricter DNA tests of the meat industry. Do you think, Martin, that's the solution?
Well, I think it probably is one solution at the very least. I mean, there needs to be some very clear testing. There need to be testing. We've announced today, our government has announced that all horse carcasses which are slaughtered in this country and then sent for export will be tested to make sure they're free of this horse painkiller boot. So, yes, again, it goes back to that point that testing to make sure you know what you have is robust, rigorous and so on. In this country, beef, for example, there's a passport system. There's meant to be a similar system with horse meat, but how well that's enforced is another matter. Certainly with beef, our beef, I think, is probably a pretty good product. And the controls and the traceability of where that's coming and going to and from is very good. But if we don't have those checks along the way of things like DNA, as you just said, then again, there's the possibility with such an extensive food chain for erroneous products to get into the food chain and us to be eating as consumers things that we don't want to be eating and don't know what we're eating.
Well, let's take that point to Andrew, because I know, no pun intended, you have a bigger beef with the system. Is it just a matter of increasing the tests, or should some attention be paid to the regulations themselves? What are the rules of these tests? Because a lot of things go into the food chain that we don't know about, or perhaps don't really want to know about.
There is an argument that some of this has come about because our beef regulation is quite good. I don't know if you've ever seen a horse passport, but it's like a large checkbook. It runs to pages and pages. You cannot move, sorry, a cow passport. You cannot move a cow from one field to another willy-nilly, driving them around. Everything's locked down. Post BSE, everything was, you know, all audited and looked at, and you know, it's almost, one would say, watertight, or a lot better than it used to be, certainly. And it's almost like, well, if this is so regulated now, should we apply some of that to other things? So yes, regulation is one sort of thing, but we tend to regulate for the last crisis. So this was all set up in Post BSE. Now we'll set this up to sort of stop this horse meat and extra things getting in the supply chain, and the next crisis might be something completely different that we haven't thought about yet.
So what should we be thinking about, given your experience and your knowledge of the food chain? You know, there are all kinds of objections. Pink slime getting in, the way that the factory lines mix up different food products. I mean, looking at maybe things from a more holistic perspective, how should we be reviewing regulations, do you think?
Well, I think that there needs to be a sort of consensus. First of all, we don't want to sort of draw rapid conclusions. We're going to need to look at this in a cool, calm and collective way, both government and the retailers. The old law about laws and sausages being made, and you should never witness that, applies here. We don't want to rush into anything because we need to sort of take a long, hard look. And I think that the regulations that need to come in are better traceability and better accountability and shorter food chains. So we need to have retailers not pushing and pushing and pushing back, who push back on other people, who go back even more. We need to have shorter food chains and more accountability. And quite frankly, we need some punishment. People need to be hung out to dry for this, I think. Someone somewhere's dropped the ball. And, you know, we need to be looking at some sort of punishment for these sorts of people.
Talking about punishments, perhaps, Martin, do you think there needs to be some legal changes here so that if you have a previous conviction, like I mentioned, in doing this sort of stuff, it should be one strike and you're out, not 2 or 3?
Well, I think that's absolutely correct. I don't think there should be any dispute about that, really, that you shouldn't be given a second chance, given the...
because from what's been reported
I
in the
agree.
Dutch
I
media, these guys went back and they're doing it again.
Well, as I said, I think the same applies here in this country as well. So I don't think. So I think that's absolutely a clear case for action to be taken, because it would be a very big incentive for those involved in the trade, obviously, not to transgress the rules. That's absolutely simple, I think. Yes, and I think we do also need to have a look to make sure that there is some proper responsibility further up as well. We talked about the retailers before. Whether there's some corporate responsibility, I'm not quite sure. I need to look at the law in detail and take some advice from people who are more legally trained than I am as to whether the law, for example, at the moment, will allow some corporate responsibility, because otherwise the danger is, what happens is, as we see with many things, that the people at the top who are selling the product, or the end producer, consumer and so on, passes the buck down to the small person at the bottom and says, well, actually my contractor, they're the ones who created the problem, it's not my fault, and they escape responsibility for it as well. And I think, again, if we want to ensure that the people further up the scale pay proper attention and are really rigorous in ensuring that what they've got in front of them is what they think it is and what we think it is, then there needs to be some potential lever there to make sure that they can be sanctioned as well.
All right, and a final brief thought from Andrew. If this is an organised sort of criminal conspiracy, as the British Environment Secretary is talking about, does that say something about the level of policing and investigative resources which should be put into monitoring what goes on with criminal gangs in the food industry? They're not making pens and paper. This goes into people's mouths and systems.
Yeah, I entirely agree. I mean, food's something that everybody needs. Like you say, times are tight, and there's a criminal opportunity there. Only a couple of weeks ago, 1,400 sheep were stolen in Lincolnshire and disappeared, and no one knows where they are. You know, cattle rustling. People are trying to make money. People are desperate, and people are going around selling meat door to door, and you know, we're almost looking at sort of contraband food, like cigarettes and alcohol, maybe. Who knows? We need tougher policing, certainly, but the consumer, my advice, my one tip, if you want to have what's in your food, make it yourself.
All right, let's thank our guests for their contributions. Andrew Webb and Martin Bentham joining us from London. And thank you very much for tuning in on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, just email us your thoughts at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. I'm Sami Zaidan. Goodbye for now.